So here's a question for you, and I'm sure it is a question that you have either asked yourself or gotten answers to without ever bothering to ask it. And I'm sure some of those answers have been satisfactory, and some of them you have found to be a bit wanting. Why are there four Gospels in the New Testament? Why isn't there just one? So, what I'm going to try to do today is I'm going to try to give you a historical answer as to the early church definitely wrestled with this question and how did they come up with their solution. And then I will leave it up to you to stack that along with all of the other answers that you have gotten as time has gone on. And hopefully you'll find at least one of them worthwhile. There was a bishop by the name of Irenaeus, and he was the bishop in Lyon in Gaul, which is modern-day France, and he was around the end of the 2nd century AD. And he answered the question as to why there are four Gospels this way. Quote, the Gospels could not possibly be either more or less in number than they are. Since there are four zones of the world in which we live, and four principal winds, while the church is spread all over the earth, and the pillar and foundation of the church is the gospel and the spirit of life, it fittingly has four pillars, everywhere breathing out incorruption and revivifying men. End quote. So there you have it. There are four winds, and therefore there is four gospels. And cue joke about Bob Dylan, the answer is blowing in the wind, and end the podcast there, and we'll see you next time. Or we could go on, because luckily Irenaeus did as well. One of the things you got to keep in mind with why there might be four Gospels is you're also dealing with the question of, well, how did these Gospels get around, and what were people in the 2nd and 3rd century dealing with when they had these Gospels? And what you then have to trace back and is these Gospels, the four Gospels that we have, were not all written at the same time in the same place. Mark is thought to be the earliest Gospel, written in the late 60s, it is thought, followed by Matthew, Luke, and then finally John. Most scholars agree is the last Gospel written. And so they're also thought to have been written in different places. So you can assume that there are churches in, let's say, Spain. Let's go to Barcelona, beautiful city. They might have access to Mark, and they might have access to Mark for years or decades before they ever get a copy of Luke. And so a traveling apostle might come in, and we know this happened, and they would bring books or letters from various other apostles, and they would come to Barcelona and they would say, I have the Gospel of Luke. And the church would be, well, that's wonderful. We have the Gospel of Mark. And they would make copies and exchange. And then when the apostles went on, they would have two copies of two different Gospels instead of one. And this is how the dissemination of the New Testament occurred. And this is how we know that it happened. And so what you then have to fast forward to is now you're in the late 2nd century, and you have then churches with all these different Gospels floating around and deciding which ones to keep and which ones to reject. And the cutting line really was, is this acceptable to read out loud for the church, or is this not acceptable to read out loud for the church? And then all of a sudden you seem to have this pattern of, in the proto-Orthodox church, and more on that term in a minute, they were constantly always referring to these four and only these four Gospels that we have today in our canon. We also, though, have to take a step back and realize that there were many other Gospels floating around. We've already talked about a couple of them. And Origen, who was a wonderful theologian down in Alexandria, he claimed to have known of at least 30 different Gospels that he had known and read, but he only thought 4 were okay to read in church. So you then have the interesting situation of, not only are you not asking the question of what is the one Gospel, but you're saying which ones do I read and which ones do I not. Proto-Orthodox is just a term that until the Council of Nicaea in 325, there was no definitive stamp as to this is the correct way of viewing things and this is the incorrect way of viewing things. That really can only be applied after the first ecumenical council in 325. So what scholars typically do is they refer to everything before that. All the different church fathers who were in line with what eventually was declared Orthodox, they get labeled Proto-Orthodox instead of being retrogradely called Orthodox. The point, though, here is that there is a steady, consistent thread of the four Gospels that eventually do make it into the canon are the four that are always being referred to. Justin Martyr, who was a philosopher in Rome in the mid-2nd century, around 150, he would always refer to them as, quote, the memoirs of the apostles. And he would always be quoting those four. And all of the proto-Orthodox people would always be quoting those four. Now, that doesn't mean that everything was always smooth sailing with them. They were bothered by some of the little odd inconsistencies and the meaning of why are there four instead of just the one. And one person in Rome, whose name was Tatian, took it upon himself to harmonize all four. Now, interestingly enough, he took the four that are in the canon today, and those were the four he used, and he mashed them all together to have them tell only one story. So instead of having your New Testament have four Gospels, there was only one, this amalgamation, this blending that Tatian put together that he called the Diatessaron. Tatian, for reasons beyond that, actually ended up being declared a heretic, and as is popular in the 2nd century, when you're declared a heretic by the Proto-Orthodox, you don't then become Proto-Orthodox, you just go and start your own church. That's what Tatian did. He was originally from Syria, he moved back to Syria and opened up his own churches, and then for the next several centuries, the Diatessaron, that blend that Tatian had come up with, was then the standard gospel that was read for a very long time. Tatian also actually left us an apologetic work that was extremely popular, and even after he was declared a heretic, continued to circle in the Proto-Orthodox circle. So they knew that there's tension. There's tension by bringing in the four. But at the same time, they weren't happy with Tatian's solution of combining them all into one. And one of the reasons why, and this is the other real big reason that I'm going to leave you with besides the four winds, is, and this again goes back to our friend Irenaeus. Irenaeus recognized that there's tension with four instead of one. But at the same time, what he saw was there were all these non-proto-Orthodox or heretical groups of Christianity floating around as well. The 2nd century is my favorite time of church history because I always refer to it as the Wild West, where it was kind of almost theology. Any theology you could come up with pretty much goes and had its own church. And the reason why is, again, there was no stamp of orthodoxy until 325. But what the church fathers were noticing was that if only one of the Gospels, and that's of the four that eventually made it, we're not even talking about the other 26 or so that existed that never were even considered. But if you're only relying on one, then you typically are falling into a heretical line of theological thinking. For example, if you only have Mark, you typically end up coming to what is called an adoptionist Christology. An adoptionist Christology is if you only have Mark, you notice that Jesus' ministry begins at his baptism. There's no birth narrative, as we already talked about. And so you can read it as Jesus was just a man. During the baptism, the heavens opened, down comes the Holy Spirit, and God declares, "This is my son who I am well pleased." And it was at that point that Jesus went from being a man to being a God-man. And then at the crucifixion, what are the last words of the crucifixion for Mark? My God, why have you forsaken me?" So an adoptionist thinking that Jesus was a man who was adopted by God and then abandoned at the crucifixion, could make a pretty substantial argument that he's right or she is right with that interpretation of Mark if you only have Mark. If you only have Matthew, Matthew is the most Jewish of the Gospels, and we'll say a lot more about that later when we eventually get to Matthew. But there was an early heretical movement called the Ebionites, who were an extremely Jewish and tried to very much hold on to all the Jewish laws, customs, and Torah, and they would just prefer to have Matthew. Those who were Gnostic and had a very Platonic idea of Jesus were huge fans of only following John. So what the church fathers recognized was you had to have the four of these together and bring in that tension, because with that tension also comes an ironing out and a movement towards the proto and eventually Orthodox view of Jesus and his Christology. So that's it. That's your real brief why there might be four. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Next time, we will talk a little bit more of these four Gospels, and we'll ask another interesting question that you might not think is a question at all, and that is, who wrote them? We'll talk about that later, and I hope you guys stay safe, take care of each other, be your brother's keeper. Cheers, guys.